I hope they do. The ambition for tonight is to give you information on a decision you're going to make on the 23rd of June, whether we stay in or leave the European Union. So I think it is going to be an interesting discussion tonight. One further point, if a phone does ring, then I'm afraid there will be a penalty, and that you will be joining me on the abseil for St Vincent charity. Right, let me firstly introduce the panel. Starting from my left, James Greenwood from the Forest of Dean is representing the Green Party, and indeed representing politics in terms of the environment, and we are very interested to hear from him in terms of what legislation the impacts of legislation on the environment. Julie Girling, MEP, Conservative MEP, representing the South West and Gibraltar, elected in 2009. Very well-known politician in this part of the world, so will clearly be giving her views in terms of Remain. And directly to my left, Neil Carmichael, a friend and a neighbour, so to speak, Conservative MP for Stroud, representing again the Remain in Europe. To my left, David T.C. Davis, MP for Monmouth, elected in 2005, so a long-serving Conservative MP, very passionate about the European Union and indeed what we should be doing with the European Union, and we'll be talking to you about leaving the European Union. And to his left, William Dartmouth, MEP, again for the South West and Gibraltar, again elected in 2009, representing the UKIP party. And he will again speaking very passionately, I've seen some of his YouTube videos, about the impact of leaving the European Union. I do have a number of questions.
Well, thank you very much. Really good question. The answer to the number of applications we made is 3. Harold Macmillan tried in 1962. Harold Wilson tried again in 1967-68. And Edward Heath tried and successfully managed the achievement in 72-73. There were really 3 reasons why we wanted to join the European Union, under Harold Macmillan, again under Wilson, again under Heath, and they are that we noticed that the existing members of the European Union, then Germany, France, Italy and so on, were actually doing very well economically in contrast to our own performance. France had actually already accelerated very speedily and effectively. We were thinking to ourselves that their improvements in productivity and their improvements in trade performance were bettering ours, and there was one good reason we thought, and that was the European Union. The second reason is that it was a particularly difficult time. You'll remember the Cuban Missile Crisis took place at the same time. The United States were concerned about the unity of Europe generally, and we thought that it would be helpful in terms of security for us to make an application, and that's what we did. And the third reason was that that whole period really coincided with the end of our colonial power. We'd actually effectively retreated from Africa, although there were some colonies still in place, notably Rhodesia. But essentially we had effectively lost our colonial strength, and the Commonwealth was really just beginning and was no significant size at that time. It has become bigger, but as you all know, every single Commonwealth leader wishes us to remain in the European Union. So those are 3 reasons. End of colonial strength, need for more security, and above all, concern and interest in increasing our economic productivity.
William Dartmouth, improved security, is that one of the reasons we joined the EU?
Well, I'm rather old, actually. I was born in 1949, so I sort of distantly do remember. By the way, the questioner said, please don't say what we joined, but we didn't join the European Union. We joined a common market, and that's the whole point. So you can't just say, don't talk about that. That's 100% of the point. Now, I'm prepared to admit this. I'm old enough that I voted in the 1975 referendum, and I voted in favour of staying in. And what I voted in favour of was staying in a common market, which was basically about trade. Now, the detailed question, just to answer it in 2 lightning bits of detail, the unity of Europe, which the Americans were concerned about, it was, of course, the unity of Western Europe against Sabre's expansion. And that doesn't really apply now, it's not in the same way. And secondly, the economic growth, it has now become apparent that the economic growth enjoyed by the original 6 countries, particularly with France and Italy, was in large part derived from a movement of people from agriculture, from working in agriculture to working in industry. And what we now find, and this is relevant to now, is that the economic prospects for the European Union as it now is absolutely dire. Something happened in the first quarter of 2016, the end of March the 31st. And I'll tell you what it was. Production in the European Union outside the UK reached the same level that it had in 2008. So they've had a lost 8 years. So you can forget about the economic growth in 1975. It's the economic growth now which we should be concerned with, and it's absolutely flatlining. And certain economies, for instance, the Greek economy, is in fact contracting.
Julie Gerling, the economy of Europe, is it flatlined?
Well, it depends what numbers you look at, where you start. My view is this: I'm often told that we are the 5th biggest economy in the world and we can stand alone. My response to that is always, well, we're the 5th biggest economy in the world as part of the European Union. We didn't get there by mistake. We're in that position because of the cooperative relationship that we have with Europe, because of the trading relationships that we have with Europe. If we take that away, there is absolutely no guarantee at all that we will increase our economic vitality, and there are many, many risks that we will decrease in economic vitality. So whether Europe is flatlining, all economics is cyclical. If you look at any history of economics, you can see it's cyclical. What we have to look at is not what the short or medium term issues will be, but whether in the long term we're better off out of Europe or in. And my view is very firmly that all the indications are that we are better off staying in, and we will make. There is absolutely no restraint on British entrepreneurialism, there's no restraint on our ability to trade. We can do that within the European Union and we will flourish.
Can I take a comment from the floor? Has anybody got any comments on that specific question? Alan Kite.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm rather puzzled by that response, the rather glowing view of Europe at the moment. Having just travelled to Italy, and I go to Spain regularly, the unemployment levels in all of the European countries, with the exception of Germany, are staying exceedingly high. When you talk to people in Italy, for example, the unemployed young are as high as 50%. Staggering. And the same applies in Spain, and unemployment levels are exceedingly high. I cannot see that anything that's happening at the moment is changing this particularly, and I'm not interested in whether Europe is flatlining or whatever. The people there have not got jobs and they're extremely worried. One of the comments made in Italy was, had we not got the euro here, we would at least be able to reduce our prices based on a currency which was sinking down to deal with that. There's no effort being made by the European Union to sort out the problem, and that is why a lot of people are very, very concerned about what's happening now.
David Davis.
Well, I think Neil's answered factually, and I just add to what William said, because people of an older generation tell me that when they voted in '75, they were voting to go into a free trade area. I think if I were 18 in 1975, I would have voted to go into a free trade area, and I think if we come out, then we'll be looking to remain part of a free trade area, and there's no reason why we shouldn't. But what people weren't told in the 70s was that this is a political project. And whenever I go over to Brussels, people are very open about it. I mean, it's not a conspiracy. You know, to be fair, they are quite frank. European Union means just what it says. Ever closer union means just what it says. These people are quite clear and open that they want to build a United States of Europe. And I don't think Britain should be part of it. I think we should at the very least be debating it. And the real question for us is not whether we like the European Union as it was in 1975, or whether we're willing to put up with it now with all the inconveniences that it causes all of us. The question is really, are we prepared to stay with this for another 10, 20, 25 years when it will move gradually but inexorably towards the super-state which people like Barroso and many others, Delors, are quite open that they are trying to build? That's the real question for us all.
Can I take a top comment over here?
Well, I'm old enough to have voted in the previous, which I'm 71, so I actually remember it quite clearly. I remember quite clearly reading stuff that Edward Heath wrote that described all that political union stuff. That's why I voted for it. So don't con us saying it was just a commercial transaction. That's not true. Heath actually published a whole lot of stuff, including joining the single currency, which I regret we didn't do. I mean, the point surely about the single currency is there's 500 million people across Europe. They pay all their bills in euros. Nearly everything they buy and sell locally is stuff that's been made in euros and is paid for in. It doesn't matter to them if it's going up and down.
Okay.
Because they're just a local economy.
Neil Carmichael, can you come back on that?
Yeah, I want to make 2 points. First, I want to extend that particular one. If you look at the manifesto of 1974 and the big policy document book that the Conservative Party published, you'll find on, I think, the section on Europe, that we were actually pledged to join the single currency by 1980. That was a pledge far too far, but it points out very clearly what Ted Heath's government's intentions were, and actually that was still in vogue in the 1976 and 77 publication of the same document. So that endorses what you have just said. The Earl of Dartmouth pointed out...
Sorry,
that
William, sorry, I don't use it. William Dunn.
Use what?
William Dunn. Don't use my title, please.
Okay. Pointed out that he thought that we joined just a trading organisation. The fact is, the European Union, as we now know it, was created in 1956, and we were not members. We decided to try and create a free trade area called EFTA. Some of you will know about EFTA. It failed. It could not get off the ground because it was just a free trade area and had no structure behind it, and that's why it did not take off. And that is actually why we ended up in 1962 trying to join the then common market. But if you read the Treaty of Rome, which was written in 1956, you are left in no doubt what the intentions were. And I don't mind people arguing about what they don't like about the European Union. What I do find irritating is when people claim it is something that wasn't, or it's something that it isn't. And it is what it is, and that's what I think we've got to accept.
Let's move on from that one now. Thank you, Philip. Can we have Bob Gower, please? Is Bob Gower here?
In the event of Brexit, why is it assumed that it will be easy to make a trade deal with the EU which would give us free access to the single market, especially when the EU will have every incentive to discourage other members from leaving?
This is a question that's been preying on my mind. I mean, if we leave the EU, we are trading by ourselves. We clearly need to make further trade agreements. So, William, why is it going to be easy to make these trade deals?
Well, first of all, can I give the context of it? The context is this. A country or a business in a country does not need to have a trade agreement in order to be able to trade. So, for example, with the United States, we export roughly, last year we exported £57 billion. We don't have a trade agreement with the United States. We never have had a trade agreement with the United States. Now, as far as exports to the European Union is concerned, the top 3 exporters, China, Russia, and the United States, do not have trade agreements with the European Union. The 6 of the top 10 exporters do not have trade agreements with the European Union. 11 of the top 20 do not have trade agreements with the European Union. You don't need to have a trade agreement in order to be able to trade very successfully, and trade very, very profitably. Now, the reason that they're able to do that is because they trade under World Trade Organization rules, which is a structure under which world trade takes place. Now, one of the penalties we pay for being a member of the European Union is that our seat on the WTO is in abeyance. We only have observer status, and we're subsumed as one of 28. Now, that's the context. Now, the specific question is, why is it so straightforward to basically have a trade agreement? The reason is this. We run, there are 2 reasons. First of all, as a question of fact, the European Union has got trade agreements with the Republic of Madagascar, with the Seychelles, with Belize, with Chile, with all sorts of countries all over the world. And so it would simply make no sense for them not to have a trade agreement with the UK, even though we don't actually need one. Further to that, we're actually running a massive trade deficit with the European Union. Now, in terms of mercantilism, which is the great French idea of mercantilism, which is what China is doing now, in public policy, that may not be a very good thing. But it is a rather good thing if you want to make a trade agreement. Because there's a commercial imperative. There's a commercial imperative for there to be a trade agreement. So I'd sum it up in one sentence of 8 words. A trade agreement with the European Union on Brexit is not necessary. It's not necessary at all. But in practical terms, it is nonetheless absolutely inevitable.
But the question really is we jump out of the club, the boys' club, we jump out of it. They're pissed off. Why on earth would they want to come and trade with us again?
Well, hang on, because they make money doing so. They make money doing so. I mean, I don't want to question a questioner, but it seems to me that the implicit assumption in your suggestion is that we leave. The smelling salts have to be fetched for President Juncker and all the rest of the usual suspects. And in consequence, Daimler and Volkswagen and Spanish producers of fruit and French wine vessels won't trade with us. I mean, frankly, you're a great man, and thank you for all you've done, but I just cannot agree with the assumption on which that question appears to be based.
Julie Gilling, I mean, clearly if we jump out of the club, the prices will go up because they can make them go up. Are we going to get trade agreements with other countries in Europe?
Well, this is one of the great unknowns, and I'm not in the business of peddling fear. So I would say, and I'm a great supporter of staying, but if we leave, then that has to be our absolute priority, has to get some sort of trading deal with our biggest trading partner. It's of benefit to both sides. So it's an absolute priority. Now, how will that happen quickly enough to make sure that we don't suffer economically? Well, you have to look at the politics, I'm afraid, and the politics is that the European Union members that we leave behind have got all sorts of reasons why they don't want contagion of our referendum and are leaving. That's not a concern for ours, perhaps, when we vote, but it's something we should consider when we think about whether we're going to be given a good deal. Next year, both the French and the Germans have big elections. Both the French and the Germans have Eurosceptic political minorities. Marine Le Pen, Alternative for Deutschland. They will be absolutely keen to make sure that those bodies do not get any encouragement at all to go the same way as the UK. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, that's the political reality. And they will make it as difficult as possible for the UK to get a good deal. And I'm not trying to be scary. I hope it's not true, but my political judgment is that that's true. And I just quote Lord O'Donnell, who was Cabinet Secretary, so he knows a bit about these intergovernmental negotiations. And he said, it's worth remembering, it took Greenland 3 years to negotiate an exit deal, even though the entire population of their country could fit into Wembley Stadium, and they were only interested in fish. And it took 3 years. So how long is it going to take?
Neil, I sit on the LEP here. We've got some very, very good businesses within this county. Clearly they take their own initiatives. They're very strong businesses. They're growing businesses. Why wouldn't these businesses grow outside the EU?
I think there are really 3 things we've got to bear in mind in this debate. The first is that it's the amount of trade, not necessarily where we trade. And we trade with the European Union 5 times more than we trade with China. We trade about 20 times more with the European Union than we do.
William's joining us on the app service.
That would be interesting. I'm glad it was his.
The ropes will be attached.
So 44% of our trade goes to China. We are, sorry, to the European Union. We trade with China just a fifth of that amount. That is the next biggest. And so we've got to understand the proportions here. So we've been putting at risk huge amounts of trade if we leave the single market. So that's the first point. The second one is, if you look around the world and ask yourself which country wants us to stay in the European Union, virtually all of them do. So they're hardly likely to rush in to have a bilateral agreement with us. Take, for example, New Zealand. Everybody says, oh, New Zealand, we should be exporting and importing with New Zealand. But the Prime Minister there said this: if New Zealand had something like the European Union, they'd join it. And if they're already in it, they'd stay. And that's one of our key allies speaking. So we've got to understand that out there, most of the countries that we would want to trade with actually want us to stay in the European Union. So that is the second key point. The third point is, there is some kind of belief that goes around that to have free trade, all you really have to do is express the intention to have it, and therefore free trade emerges. No, you have to agree it. And the agreement process is very complicated, because you have to decide what you are agreeing about and how those agreements are actually unfolded. That's why the Leave campaign got in so much trouble when they started talking about Canada. Because, of course, the agreement that Canada has does not include automobile manufacturing of any sort or financial services. So that would be utterly useless to us, since we are a net exporter of both of those critical sectors. If you take Norway, for example, people say, oh, that's an answer. But the Norwegians actually pay to have access to the single market. And they have none of the benefits that we have negotiated in terms of movement of labour or whatever. So they actually get a worse deal in the context of involvement and a pretty high bill to pay to actually have that trade. So that's the third problem which we'd have. And the fourth problem, if three aren't enough, is that we would actually have to create 66 new free trade agreements to get back to the position we were in through the European Union. And it takes on average about 7 or 8 years to negotiate one. So if you think just how complicated that process would be and how damaging that process would be to firms in Gloucestershire, that's, I think, a really important stage to go.
Let's take a comment from the floor. Does anybody want to ask a comment on that?
Yeah.
Stand up, sir.
Sorry. Yeah, afternoon. Neil Hopwood. I actually work for the AEP. I'm here really to get a really good understanding of the questions. The issue of we talk about cost. Norway was used as an example. I mean, it's a statement of fact, I think, that our net contribution is 8.5 billion. So how does that compare in terms of what the costs of accessing some of those markets would be?
Well, that's...
I can answer that.
Well,
I can answer
David,
Well, let
$83.
me just say that actually anyone campaigning for Remain to exit doesn't usually mention Norway. It's not seen as a good example because they're in the EEA, which is a waiting room for the European Union, and they choose to implement European legislation and they choose to pay money into the club. So Norway's not a great example anyway. It's only ever used by people campaigning to remain in. Let me just go back to what William said. He's absolutely right. Think about it. We import more from the European Union than we export to the European Union. So it's crazy to think that the French government are going to tell their farmers that they're going to have to be laid off because they can no longer send food over to Britain. It'd be quite good for British farmers if they did actually, but it's not going to happen, I'm afraid to have to say. The Germans aren't going to tell their car workers that they're going to have to be laid off and we can no longer have Mercedes-Benzes or BMWs. Again, it'd be quite good for people in Nissan if they did, but it's not going to happen. You know, they're not stupid, these politicians. Let me just turn the question around a little bit. You know, the presumption seems to be that these are evil people in the rest of the European Union who will punish us if we speak our minds. Are they? Are they going to punish us like that because we've chosen to leave the club? If the club is so good, surely they would be sad to see us go, but welcome the fact we've spoken our mind and wish us well as we choose another path. I think if I were to suggest that they were this evil cabal of prime ministers and presidents in the European Union waiting to punish us, you'd probably think I was being a bit hysterical about it. And when Julie talks about wanting to prevent a contagion, what she actually means is wanting to prevent members of the public in other European Union countries from expressing their own opinions about the EU. And this worries me, because every time there is a referendum on the EU, as we saw recently in the Netherlands, people have tended to reject it. And what we see here is European elites, frankly, politicians, not wanting to listen to the voices of their own members of the public. So I just go back to the original point. It isn't going to happen. We can trade without a trade agreement anyway, and we do trade more with America than any other EU country, despite not having a trade arrangement. It will be in the interests of all of the other countries in the European to come to a quick arrangement with us, and if we do decide to leave, we would have at least 2 years to sort it out anyway. So, as the head of Remain has said, and Lord Kerr of Kilmarnock, I think he is, who was a former a British ambassador to the European Union, this is not particularly an issue because both of them agree that it would be perfectly straightforward to put some sort of a trading arrangement in place. But hey, you're mostly on business people, and I once had a real job in business as well. And I know as well as anyone in this room, it's not politicians and their trade agreements that create trade, it's businessmen and women going out there buying and selling things that creates trade.
Okay. Let's move on. I've got a question from Jenny Henderson. Is she here?
How much money would we save each year by leaving the EU?
Right, a direct question. Let's see if we can put some facts on the table. I think we may struggle, but let's see where, if we can get these facts. Julie Gillen, would you like to kick us off?
Talking about, let's talk about straight money, because of course everything has a value, but if we talk about how much our net contribution to the EU is, which I guess is what you're getting at. Now I would suggest that we're actually paying for something with that net contribution, but let's talk about it. We see everywhere this figure of £350 million a week. And it's one of the great sadnesses to me of this referendum debate that this figure is being used so widely, particularly by politicians who I respect and have always looked up to, when it is absolutely well known and admitted by everybody that it is not the net figure, it's the gross figure. The net figure varies year on year, and I can, if you take anything of the last 3-4 years, it's slightly different every year, but it averages out at around £6 or £7 billion a year.
£6 or £7 billion a year. What do we get back from that? What benefits does the UK get from that?
Well, we get the benefit of being part of a single market, which, as we can see, some people on the panel don't value. I value it. I value it enormously. And part of the reason I value it is because we've been talking about trade. And we've been talking about trade in things. We put a tariff or no tariff on that and sell it from one country to another. But what we excel in is services. Services don't have tariffs. They don't have money preventing you from moving. They have non-tariff barriers. They have restrictive practices. They have rules and laws that stop, for example, the Italian government from being able to let a contract for building roads to a British company if they want to. Now, within a single market, they cannot. But if we lose the single market, and that's part of what we're paying for, that wouldn't be subject to a WTO agreement. That would simply be subject to what we're all familiar with, is a non-tariff barrier to prevent British companies being able to sell their services. And that's hugely important to us as a country. It's not just road building, it's financial services particularly. All the euro-denominated trade that takes place in the city would move to Frankfurt, we would lose thousands of jobs. So that's partly what that excess is going towards.
Okay. William, £6 to £7 billion a year, money well spent?
Well, it actually isn't, but I actually dispute that thing. First of all, we in UKIP have never put forward this particular figure, and I'll tell you why. Because it's not just the direct costs, which are the fees, And by the way, the fees are only going to go one place, and that's up. The present rebate is only there till 2020. And in addition, if the Conservative Party, Conservative government, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats get their way, and 5 very poor countries, Serbia, Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Macedonia, and Turkey, become members of the European Union, we're going to have to pay vastly more in cohesion costs. But the real cost of the European Union is the indirect costs. Please bear in mind that only about 12.5% of the British economy is accounted for by exports to the European Union. 95% of British companies don't export to the European Union at all. Nevertheless, 100% of our economy is subject to EU regulation. And if you look at that, plus the cost of, for example, the common fishery policy, the corruption, waste and fraud in the EU institutions, the possible costs of bailing out the Eurozone, we've already made some payments to Greece, fines, DEFRA, which deals with farmers, was fined £680 million just the other day by the European institution. You're looking at total costs, indirect costs, of over 100 billion a year, and that is the cost that we ought to be looking at. And that is certainly 1,000% not worth it. In terms of lightning thing in terms of trade, services, Julie Gurning was absolutely right to say there's all sorts of disruption in services. The single market is only complete 5% in terms of services. 95% it isn't actually complete at all. And then the average tariff, and then this phrase about trade at risk. It's very important that we drill down on this. And sorry, Chairman, is the contention of Mr. Carmichael and others that all the trade is going to stop? And if it isn't the contention, how much of the trade does he think is going to stop?
Okay, let's bring in James here. I'd like to know, James, 6 or 7 billion or 100 billion, whatever it may be. Are we getting anything out of that in terms of the environment policy? Is there anything else that we should be looking at in terms of what the EU gives us?
I like the idea of a cohesion cost. I haven't heard that word used before, but I think we should take ourselves right back and remind ourselves why 5 countries came together in the first place: to trade and to bring together and to manage coal and steel. And the reason for that was because those were the main instruments of destruction which had been used so horrifically in the Second World War. And I think that the peace cost, the peace dividend that we get from our membership is absolutely huge. In terms of just some numbers, the net contribution, and you can look at various ways of working it out, but it's about 0.4% of GDP. So not a very high figure. That's about £4.50 per household per week. And the CBI reckons that in terms of trade and in terms of low prices, it benefits the average household to the tune of about £3,000 per week. I know we're going to be talking about the environment later, okay. So rather than going into that now,
Okay, well I've got from the government documents every penny in a pound, which doesn't seem a hell of a lot, to be honest. Let's take a comment from the floor. Gentleman here. Mike's just behind you.
Thank you. Now, I know exactly how much the EU costs me because in November I received from HMRC an annual breakdown of my tax.
Can we have a look?
And it's always publicly available in Germany actually, because I was at a conference in Göttingen, our twin town, Cheltenham's twin town, back in December when the discussion was on the implications of Britain leaving the EU. And I had recently received this from HMRC, and it made interesting reading, because I'm an average taxpayer, I guess. I'm retired. I'm on quite a good pension with other bits of money, and I reckon I'm earning roughly average. And my tax bill was about £3.5 grand for this particular tax year, 2014-15.
You're doing well, sir.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I know I'm among incredibly high earners here. So, but the fact of the matter is that when I put this to our German friends, and they were from about 20 different organisations across Germany, and said, "How much do you think I pay in my tax towards being a member of the EU, and I had a bit of an auction. The figures range from about £400 down to £100. And I said, you're all wrong. You're all wrong by a huge factor. I pay, as an average-ish taxpayer, £20 a year as my contribution to the EU budget, and it's here, the government tells me that. Now that's 6p a day, and I think that's an absolute bargain. My career for nearly 40 years was with young people, and I got huge amount of grants. I guess over the last 20 years I got grants about 30,000 a year from the EU to fund young people's mobility, from Cheltenham and across the rest of Europe. And one of the reasons I think that huge numbers of unemployment in southern Europe and Eastern Europe to a degree amongst young people has not resulted in massive riots and social disorder is because of the effort the EU puts and the money the EU puts to fund social programmes to help young people at this moment in the cycle where, as Julie says, economics are difficult. So, that's my point.
So I'd love to change the tax bills later on if you want. Firstly, I mean, we are 6p. It doesn't sound an awful lot. I think my view is that if that is the case, then we're getting good value for money. There's all sorts of other things, and we'll come on to security in a moment. But David Davis, please.
Well, the House of Commons Library, which is independent, supplied me with a figure, the net cost of £8.5 billion, which I would suggest is a lot of money, and I'm not going to try and work that out per person. I would completely dispute this idea of grants, sir, because yes, they're very generous with the grant funding. They'll even ask you to put up a poster saying this or that project has been paid for by the European Union, but it hasn't. It hasn't been paid for by the EU. It's been paid for by you, because we're putting £8.5 billion in, and we're getting we're not even getting back the money that we put in. We're putting in £8.5 billion more than we get back after all those grants have been given to us. Now, it's insulting that we're going to put up these bloody posters thanking them for giving us back a percentage of our own money. But, you know, this is the thing that gets me most of all. It doesn't take account of all sorts of other costs. I thought it was outrageous, for example, that the Prime Minister went off there to solve the benefits problem. And by the way, I'm married to an Eastern European migrant. Can I just point this out? So when people say we've got to embrace our European partners, I say, well, I've got 3 kids. I do think it's wrong that people can come over here and claim benefits and claim child benefits for children who don't even live in this country, who are living in countries where things are much cheaper, and yet the Prime Minister couldn't even get that problem properly sorted out. That's an indirect cost to us. It's an indirect cost when people come over here to use the NHS, and we spend far more treating foreign nationals on the NHS than we'll ever get back. And you try utilising the NHS in Hungary, as I have done, because my children are bi-national, and they want ID, and they don't just hand the treatment out in the way that we do. But the most insulting thing of all for me, as somebody who ran a business, is that they can't account for the money they've had. Their own auditors are not able to sign off their own books. If I tried that when I was in business, or if any of you tried that, it is absolutely true. And years, they cannot account for the money.
It is not true.
Okay, all right. Let's.
It's not. It's absolutely true.
That's
true.
I know how rigorous
what you said before was wrong.
Okay, let's move on. Let's move on to James. You've got a point on this one.
Yeah, just a rebuttal actually to what David said.
Have you got a foreign wife, by the way?
Not yet.
So you're working on it.
She comes from Essex.
This migrant claiming benefit thing, that's about 1% of migrants. We wanted facts there. I'm going to try and give them to you. Department of Health figures on health tourism show that actually we're doing quite well out of it in Europe. We have young, working, healthy people coming to Britain to work in our country, and we are exporting people of a certain age to enjoy the fruits of the vine and the sun in Europe, and we are benefiting to the tune of about £125 million a year, according to the Department of Health.
Okay, that's interesting. Just to be clear, I've got a foreign license from Coventry.
That's very good.
I want to just turn the direction of this slightly. Mrs. Everton Sawyer's ex-MI5, MI6 chief. One of the benefits we get is sharing security information. Now, clearly security in terms of business and everything else is a benefit. It's obviously helped us track down some very unsavoury characters. I think that's great for Europe, but they're saying that if we leave Europe, we won't get that benefit. We'll be outside the club once again. I'm intrigued with that because obviously there are various contradicting opinions. William Dartmouth, what do you say about our security?
Much better, but let's talk about our security in it. First of all, the UK has been a member of Interpol since 1923. Police forces and security services can cooperate perfectly well, perfectly capably, without being in a political union. Now, further to that, we're not very far from GCHQ here, and the fact of the matter is that the cooperation between the United States and the UK's security and intelligence services is much greater than now, than ever has been, ever will be, between the European Union and the UK security services. And the last time I looked, perhaps you'll disagree with me, we aren't in a political union with the United States. And finally, I'd also make the point, if anybody wants a slightly more bit of refinement on this, is that at the time of the Paris bombings, the first lot of Paris bombings, not the second, when all those people came from Brussels, Belgium, a place where I spent a significant amount of time, as Julie Girling does, ex-President Sarkozy of France complained about the lack of cooperation between the French and Belgian security services, even though they are in the political union. Now also, and if we remain in, we've got vis-a-vis travel from Turkey coming up in the next 6 months.
We haven't got that yet. That's not going.
Hang on, we're going to have it in the next 6 months. The government are committed to full Turkish membership, and all that puts our security at profound risk. It's exactly the other way around from how the question was put.
I think the French police felt that the Belgian police were slightly incompetent, but Neil
That's what President Sarkozy said.
Neil Carmichael, we'll lose the European arrest warrant. Is that going to impact on us?
Oh, well, yes, it will, but I just want to make a couple of points about social security. Just one important thing for us all to remember, and it's this. We're the only ones that actually has a universal system, so you can come into Britain and start accessing our universal system. You try going to France as a Brit and access their social security system, and you'll fail. And it's because they do not have a universal system. We do. So if we really want to tackle this problem, it's for us to tackle by changing that universality and not to leave the European Union just because we think people are coming to plunder our system. And we've got to accept responsibility for that. It is no use trying to blame somebody else. It is us that need to make that change.
No, it's not plundering the system, it's plundering our buildings with bombs.
Yeah, and the second thing I just want to make absolutely clear to everybody is that we spend less than 1 penny in every pound that we spend totally in public expenditure. So, for example, the 8.5 billion we spend on being a member of the European Union compares to 108 billion on the health system alone. So let's get this into proportion and into perspective. It is simply daft to be talking about 1 penny in every pound that we spend in the public sector. Now on to security. There is a perception that we do not have our control over our borders, but I can tell you that there's one way to test that, and you all can. Go on holiday without your passport and try and get back. Because you'll then discover that we do have control of our borders. We are able to fish out the ones we don't want to have. We have rejected 6,000 the last 3 years from the European Union. And there is some assumption that's peddled by certain newspapers that every immigrant happens to come from the European Union. No. The fact is, more than twice as many people enter this country from beyond the European Union and not from the European Union. So we've got to get our facts right and understand exactly what the problem is. And I think that is absolutely central to this question of security. So, will we be less secure or more secure if we leave? Well, let's ask the last two chiefs of MI5 and MI6, they definitely confirm that we need to be in the European Union for data sharing, for the ability to influence how that data is collected, for the ability to make sure that the policies around that data collection are appropriate. And that's why we are so successful, in fact, at maintaining decent border control through being a member of the European Union. And the second issue, which Paul has mentioned, the question of the European arrest warrant. If you want someone to commit a crime here and then head off to the European Union and be beyond our reach, then leave the European Union. If you want to make sure that people are actually taken to justice and held for account for the things that they do, then the European arrest warrant has repeatedly proved to be an incredibly powerful tool. And the third thing that we need to remember is that actually our security forces and services do work incredibly well, and increasingly so, with our European partners. And that's proved, not actually ironically, by what some of our European friends say, it's what the Americans say. Because you'll know that virtually every single national security advisor to the president of recent times has said we are better off in the European Union for our security, and not just our security, the security of the Western world. And that's why so many Americans, from every single president since we joined the European Union to virtually all secretaries of state who have served in recent times, have confirmed. So you've got to bear in mind, these are powerful arguments and they're ones that we must consider.
Okay, I don't think I told Neil my summer story where I lost my passport. He's quite right. I turned up at the embassy in Bern and I spoke to a very nice money-penny lady, and she looked at me and said, "Mr. Fong, what makes you British?" Very awkward question. Can I take a comment from the floor in terms of the issue in terms of security? Gentlemen here.
Malcolm Cheshire. I'm Chief Executive of a company called Third Margin, which is dealing with security. I'd like to define security, which was defined by a gentleman called Giovanni Minter in 1999 as a function of the presence and interaction of asset, protector and threat in a given situation. I think the question we must ask ourselves is whether we see the EU as an asset or a threat. I know where I stand.
David Davis.
Well, I think the point's already been made that we cooperate with any country that's in our interest to cooperate with. We do a lot of cooperation with America. The security services work with the CIA, so there's no particular reason why we should join NAFTA or become the 51st state of the USA in order for that to happen, although Tony Blair seemed to have a few ideas along that lines at one point. But of course we carry on working with any country we needed to. But I think the elephant in the room here, though, is that if Turkey does come into the EU, then we're going to have a very large number of people on the Turkish border coming over from the Middle East who may well get Turkish passports, who will have an EU passport, who will be able to come straight into the United Kingdom. And that fills me with a great deal of concern, because we've already seen...
Just let me stop you there. We're not part of Schengen, so clearly there are borders that we have.
I mean, one of the interesting points actually is that wherever we've opted out of something, for example, we opted out of Schengen, and most people now seem to think that's a good idea. We've opted out of the euro, and apart from this gentleman here, he's the first person I've met in about 5 years who thinks it's a good idea. Most people would not want to argue for the euro. So the reality is that opting out of European Union projects is generally seen as a good thing afterwards.
Let's talk about porous borders. We're out of Schengen. Neil's just told me, and I can vouch for it, that if you want to try and get to Britain, you have to go through border control.
With respect, but not a lot of people, you know, thousands of people every year manage to do it without, because they don't turn up at the customs post and say, "Sorry, I've lost my passport." I wish they were all as honest as you, Paul, but they're not. And the ones who we worry about are not the ones who turn up and say, "Sorry, I've lost my passport."
Should we drop you into France and see how you get back?
We'd like to do that, Neil. Probably without a passport, then you can't be happy to pay for it.
Are we going to be a threat from terrorists walking through our laws?
So sorry, again, I think it's odd the way that you pose the question. What the point is this: so long as we're in the European Union, all the citizens of 27 other member states, and if the government and the establishment parties get their way, by the way, I think it was the Green Party, it'll be 32 other member states. They have the absolute right to live, work, settle, and settle in the United Kingdom and enter into the United Kingdom. The only thing they have to do is they have to show their passport. That's all. They still have the right to come in, and that's what the point is. And the other thing I will just say is, it is absolutely remarkable when one goes to these things that the people who are in favour of remaining, they always say, isn't it wonderful we aren't in the euro? Isn't it wonderful we aren't in the Schengen Agreement? Look at all these exclusions we've got. If there was really a strong argument for it, they would all say, we should be in the Schengen Agreement, we should be in the euro, etc., etc., etc. And that's a point which I'd like to perhaps leave people to dwell on.
Julie Govan, I mean, the EU have admitted that if we invite Turkey, the borders will become porous. As William said, we'll give them free access into our country. They just have to show a passport, Turkish, whatever it may be. Are we at threat from this?
Sorry, are you talking about if Turkey becomes a full member of the European Union?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's possible. They've been a candidate country now for almost 40 years, I believe, and they haven't made it in yet. So this imminent threat that William talks about...
Well, it's your policy, it's your policy, and you vote in favour of it all the time.
Let's see what Julie's got to say.
I wish it wasn't your policy, it's a reckless policy.
Let's hear what Julie's got to say.
Right.
Please change your mind.
You'll be doing the abseil earlier.
Okay. Can I just remind everybody that in order for a country to join the European Union, there has to be unanimity in the Council. That means the UK government have a veto. And yes, it is the case that the UK have been part of the negotiations for 40 years for Turkey to join. It is the case that Bosnia and Herzegovina, Albania, they are in theory candidate countries. It is the case also that it is the agreed policy of the current Commission and the Council that no member states will accede before the end of this cycle, which is 2019. That's absolute. And I remind you, if they do, they are subject to 100% unanimity from the Council. Things have changed. Things change all the time. The security situation with Turkey and the Turkish border has changed hugely in the last 3 years. We're no longer talking about this band of Turks that everyone's so frightened of. We're talking about Syrians, Iraqis, Afghanis, and indeed Pakistanis coming in through that route. That changes the attitude of our government. So if we had the accession of Turkey on the table now, despite the fact that, yes, in theory, they're up for it, there's been a lot of talk about, okay, maybe allowing Turkey to be a member, but without free movement. You know, everything is, within the European Union, everything is not as rigid as everyone tries to make out. It will be up for negotiation.
Let's have your comment on this one.
I've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan and the Middle East, and I'm not frightened of these people. They are some of the loveliest people I've ever met, and a lot of them are fleeing the most awful conflict. Just a point about this sort of instant passport thing. If you're a refugee in Germany, I'm just going to read out what's required for you to get a passport. You have to have an unlimited residence permit to be in Germany. You have to live in Germany for 8 years, be able to sustain yourself and your family without taking benefits, speak sufficient German, take an immigration test, have no criminal record, pledge allegiance to German basic law, and have given up or lost your former citizenship. So this idea of people just walking in and being given a passport is absurd. And some of these people who are in desperate need, we should be helping.
You forgot to mention you have to pay £90 for the privilege as well. I've got another question now from Daniel Wilson.
Good afternoon. Is in-migration a good or bad thing for the British economy?
In-migration. Is in-migration a good or a bad thing for the British economy? Let's start with James, please.
It's both. There is, without doubt, concern and fear about services, about housing, which I understand. But I think that in the balance, the benefit is immense. If anybody has been to any of the local hospitals in the last few years, they would have almost undoubtedly been treated by an EU migrant or possibly even from outside. The OBR says that migrants contribute an extra 0.5% to GDP growth. That's the Office of Budget Responsibility, they're the guys with the figures. 14% of new businesses in this country are started by migrants. And I know that there is an interest in housing in the audience, and one of the problems with house building at this time is a lack of skilled workers. And we need to invite people in. We should be an outward-looking, I'd say beyond Europe, globally looking country, the country that we always have been, with interests around the world and an open invitation to people to come and contribute.
James, let me just add to your comment. An unusual position for me to say there are plenty of unscrupulous developers making hay of this, because they are putting housing out there left, right and centre, chewing up the green belt, chewing up green fields, because in-migration is at such a level that we need more and more houses. What do you say to that?
I mean, I say a number of things. One, when it comes to housing, we have 800,000 empty properties in this country, which are currently not being used, which is a major problem. We also have fantastic inefficiency of the use of our housing stock. Many of us live in houses which are unsuitable for us at a certain stage in our lives. Certain houses are sometimes too small or too big, and we need somehow to free up the way in which we are able to move house more frequently. And thirdly, we need to use brown spaces more efficiently.
David Davis, let's bring Wales into the equation as well as England. Consuming our green fields, in migration, good thing or bad thing?
Well, the answer is it depends. Clearly, in my own case, it's led to a happy marriage. But Lord Rose, at the head of the Remain campaign, has said that migration is a good thing because it keeps down wages for the low paid. So if you're in a low paid job, then it's not a very good thing at all. I think it has an impact when you're talking about a net migration the size of the population of Newcastle, all of whom have to be housed, and who will have to places have to be found for schools, hospitals, and the rest of it. That is going to be a problem. Nobody's ever properly costed it. I was on the Home Affairs Select Committee for a while. You can cost how much is paid in taxes by people who've migrated, but what you can't do, and what nobody will do, is actually look at the costs to the system of providing healthcare, education, and all the other services. My wife's actually an interpreter, and that can cost a pretty penny. The other thing, and it takes us slightly away from this debate, but I think that there is a cultural issue here as well. Because I say this absolutely, and I say it to anyone, and I say it as somebody who's married to an immigrant, and actually my brother's married to somebody who's Chinese as well. So, you know, and I feel I absolutely have to say this. Anyone who comes into this country has to fit in with the rules and the customs and the culture of this country. And there are far too many people who are not doing that, and who are bringing in cultural values, which I don't accept, attitudes towards women, which I don't accept, attitudes towards people who are gay, which I don't accept, attitudes towards people of a different religion, which I could never, ever accept. And I think that we've been far too reticent in speaking out, standing up for, if you like, secular, liberal European values, because of a fear of being called racist. We mustn't do that. We must say, I don't care what colour somebody's skin is, I don't care what colour their religion is, but if you come into this wonderful European country, you have to respect other people's right to religion, you have to respect women's rights, you have to respect gay rights, you have to respect equality for all. And too many times we haven't been willing to send out that message to people who've just arrived in this country from countries where they have very, very different cultural values.
Let's take a comment from the floor. Does anybody want to make a comment on that particular lady here?
Immigration into the National Health Service. We wouldn't need so many if we didn't have so many immigrants in this country. We need the nurses because there's so many people to treat. Half the time when you go into the hospital, yes, you're treated by immigrants, but you can't understand them. Not the nurses or the doctors. And if we're not careful, there are nurses, yes, they go abroad. Why? Because the nurses in this country are nearly all foreign ones. So I don't think that's an argument. And also, the National Health Service has gone down. I think in research, for instance, they're nearly all English or English-speaking people that are in research. How many of the ones that are coming in are doing research work? All these things. I mean, at one time we had a fairly good National Health Service. And also we had good farming. We had good fishing. Where have those industries gone?
Okay.
I think there's a lot of, I know I'm not perhaps the brightest button in this room, politically
There are far worse.
anyway. I like rely on common sense. And I think if some of the business people had common sense, they would realise that perhaps, not in my lifetime, but 20, 25 years' time, their businesses might go the same way as fishing and agriculture.
Okay, thank you
So
very
I
much.
think, you know, as far as immigration goes, what are the immigrants actually doing for this country?
Neil Carmichael, I think the question is really that immigrants are overstretching our infrastructure and services. What do you say to that?
A few years ago, I went to a care home, and the manager said, there's a resident who wants to make a complaint. And I thought, well, let's see what this is about. And she came storming up to me. She was certainly mobile. And she said, Mr. Carmichael, I am 108. My complaint is that I have had a card from Her Majesty the Queen every year, but she sends the same one. The point of the story, not a story, it's a fact, the point of that incident is we're all living really rather a long time. Our demographic change in this country is such that we've basically got more than 15 million pensioners now who are wanting to be cared for, wanting to have a pension, wanting to benefit from our economy, wanting to actually live fulfilled and happy lives. And I don't blame people for wanting to live that long. I intend to make it as well. But it raises a few issues. It raises the issue about who is actually going to do the work. Because our economy currently occupies 31 million people at work. Now the question we have to ask, and it's a simple one, is if we're not going to get extra people to help us do the work, are we going to get the pensioners to start working, or are we going to start thinking about cuts in expenditure? Because our economy actually depends on people coming to work, usually with skills that we haven't got. And I could take you to several factories in my constituency of Stroud with people who have come from the European Union with skills that we definitely need. Skills in electronics, skills in design, skills in chemical engineering. And they are working in this my constituency, bringing in a lot of money, supporting an economy which is constantly growing. Our economy, despite whatever you're all thinking about the performance of other neighbouring European economies, ours is growing, and we are still in need of more skills. The engineering organisations, notably Engineering UK and the Institute of Mechanical Engineering, have pointed out that we produce 100,000 engineers a year. Good. The fact is, we need 180 to 190 engineers per year. And we are still failing to meet that. So we still need to get those people in. So the real question about immigration is this. Do you want a growing economy where we have those skills at our disposal, able and willing to expand the capacity of our economy as a whole to provide the services that you actually want? Do you want those? Because that's the essence of this. But if you say that you don't, and you're prepared to risk the economy, then actually the costs will be borne on many, many people, not necessarily in this room. That's why the Treasury pointed out that if we leave the European Union, we'd end up losing about £4,500 per household in a very short order of time. Because we won't have the ability to actually generate that economy. So the immigration that we do get from the European Union is in part of our economic growth model, and we have to accept that.
Can I just add a little tangent to that? There is an argument that if we perhaps came out of the club, we wouldn't get the great unwashed, and if we were alone, we could introduce a point system, very much like Australia does, and get the right people into our country to do what we want.
Yeah. Well, Liam Fox tried that out, and he said we should use the Australian system, and actually came out that we would end up with more people, not less.
No, come on.
It's true, it's true. If you actually analyse the people who are coming to this economy from the European Union, they are actually coming direct almost to jobs. That is certainly the case if you compare the number of people who are actually working and the number of people who are not working. Because the handbrake operation for the Social Security is basically going to affect about 34,000 people. And that's not a huge proportion of the number of people who have actually come into the European Union. And whilst I'm on this subject, gentlemen across the far left, midway down, made the very obvious point that the nearly 2 million Britons that are actually working in the European Union are not just working there producing for us, but they themselves are benefiting from our membership of the European Union. And it would be really quite reckless of us to shut the door, not just on people helping our economy, but then actually causing difficulties for the 2 million Brits actually in the European Union. So we have to think not just of what's happening immediately around here, but also what's happening in Europe for and with Britons. And I think that is something which not often is properly considered in this particular debate.
William Dartmouth, you're a big advocate of the point system, and in simple terms, it looks like it makes sense. We shut the borders, we shut the doors, and we choose the people we want. What are the disadvantages?
Well, you talk about Australian style point system, it's also what the United States insists on as well. And with respect to Mr. Carmichael, nowhere in his very eloquent speech did he mention even once, did he explain to us why that in order to get skilled people, you have to open the door to hundreds of millions of unskilled people. And Mr. Chairman, you put your finger absolutely on it. And the fact, I would also make the point, I must quickly make the distinction between, as I'm with a very sophisticated group, the distinction between GDP and GDP per capita. The population of the United Kingdom at the moment is about 60 million. If you doubled it to 120 million, we would have a higher gross domestic product. There's no question about that. We would. But in terms of gross domestic product per head of population, it would go down. And for years and years and years and years, the wealth of a country was always measured by GDP per capita, not by gross GDP, until the BBC got going on it. And if you just measure it by gross GDP, you will then find that Bangladesh is a richer country than Switzerland, which of course doesn't make any sense at all, and is demonstrably and palpably untrue. And I'll just say, and I think it's very important, the gentleman over there with the beard, who made two great questions, by the way, two great points. He said that we've had open borders and immigration for years and years and years and years and years. Well, that's not quite true. The big build-up in immigration in this country happened at two times. 1997, when the Blair government dropped the primary purpose rule, and in the context of what we're talking about now, in 2004, when the A8 countries from Eastern Europe came in, and we were the only country that gave, rightly or wrongly, that gave a completely open door. The fact of the matter is, yes, we do want to have skilled immigrants, particularly if there's job places for them. But in order to get skilled people, you do not have to have an open door to hundreds of millions of unskilled people. And that's really what the point is. And so long as we remain in the European Union, we have to have an open door to hundreds of millions of people, whether they're skilled, whether they're there, or whether or not they're unskilled, and whether or not we would choose to have them living in our country.
Okay, I'm going to take a comment from this. You're from a rural constituency. Is migration, are immigrants helping the farmers or not?
Well, they are in some instances, of course, and nobody's suggesting that people shouldn't be allowed to migrate into this country. I mean, I've never suggested that. I've never heard anyone in UKIP suggest it. I think what I do hear from people from all parties is that it needs to be controlled. You can't have uncontrolled migration or people just coming in and claiming benefits. And you also have a right, we have an absolute right to say that anyone who comes into the country should learn English and should obey the customs, if you like, of this country. There are far too many people coming in who are just not integrating at all at the moment and who are choosing not to. That's what concerns me. I'm not worried about people working on farms or anywhere else. I'm not worried about migration particularly. The principle is that anyone who comes in obeys the rules, doesn't have open access to benefits and follows the cultural customs of the UK, provided it's managed. Then great, no problem at all with it. And the farmers of Monmouthshire, by the way, generally speaking, quite split on this, as you'd expect, but a very surprising number are in favour of exit from the EU. They don't fear for 1 minute that if we exit, we'd have any problem getting migrant labour. And there's no reason why they should fear that. And overall, I think the Farmers Weekly did a survey on this, I think probably 2 weeks ago, it's very recent anyway, and they found a majority of farmers in favour of leave.
So just to be clear, if immigrant workers pick up British values, they're welcome to work here?
Of course, of course. I mean, you know, to a limited extent. I mean, I'm not suggesting we just open the doors and have anyone, because I mean, to make the point back to the gentleman back there, people will move if they can increase their standard of living quite significantly. We saw a lot of people moving in from the poorer Eastern European states, from Romania and Bulgaria, larger proportion coming over there, because there was such a difference in living standards. These states were much poorer than Poland, Hungary, and those countries, and quite a lot came from there. If you open up the gates as far as Turkey, or even beyond that, then you're going to get a much larger number of people coming in, because people will move if they can improve their living standards significantly. It's obvious, really. I mean, you know, that's why you're not ever going to have large numbers of people coming from Finland or Norway, which is outside of the EU, because they already have a high standard of living. It's why, actually, if we wanted to, we could have free movement with countries like Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, because nobody in their right mind in Japan or Singapore is going to move here for a better standard of living or the benefits. They've already got it. The whole thing, comes down to living standards. That's what gets people to move.
Neil Carmichael, have we lost? Has the government failed in establishing British values?
Well, I don't think it has. I think that we're a nation which has always been outward-looking. We've always been keen on liberal democracy. We've always been tolerant. I think we've got some issues about certain extremisms and so on, which the government is finding it difficult to deal with, but is dealing with them. I worry much more about independent schools beneath the radar, teaching young people inappropriate activities and inappropriate interpretations of their religions. I think that's far more worrying than having additional migrants from the European Union coming to fill jobs that we do not seem able to fill. I think the issue about Britain as a whole is we are a very dynamic nation. That's one of our great strengths. We've built our current position on the ability to respond to changes, to adapt, to really entertain new ideas, and I think that's something we've always been really good at. And I think the best thing about this country actually is our willingness to be a decent, tolerant society.
James Greenwood, are we good at cultural values and English values?
Well, I think of myself as hopefully a man of the world and embracing of many ideas and cultures, and I think it is a quite extraordinary country that we live in. I mean, I've been blessed to spend a lot of time outside, and one of the places I've been is Bulgaria. And why didn't all these people come flooding over as we were told they were going to? Well, that's because they've got families, and they've got homes, and they've got communities, and they've got their own lives. This idea that standard of living is entirely about money is fallacious. But I think that, having been to many other places, why I love this country so much is because it is so rammed full of interesting and diverse and innovative and creative people, and it makes it one of the best places in the world to live, without doubt.
Okay, David Davis, you spent time in the jungle, in Calais. Those are people that don't have British values and don't want British values. They want to come here. A lot of them are economic immigrants. Are we going to be better off out of the Union to protect ourselves from these people?
Well, certainly anyone in the jungle in Calais could have claimed asylum in France, and they're waiting to get over to the UK. And I asked them why, and many of them told me quite bluntly that they wanted to work and that they were making the signs of money. That's why they were coming over there. They were also mainly young men. I mean, hear all this stuff about families and children. No, not true at all. I've been to refugee camps in actually Greece, Hungary, in France and in Germany, and they are, for the most part, young men who are looking for a better standard of living, often coming not from Syria, but from Pakistan, Afghanistan, or various African countries. Some may find it easy to integrate. I fear that some will not. And I think that it's going to be much easier for us to manage our borders if we're outside of the European Union than if we're in.
Julie Girling, the Cotswolds is under siege at the moment because they have to take their own housing requirement. They are losing appeals, and part of the reason they're losing appeals is because the objectively assessed need on housing shows that they need a lot more housing, and part of that is because of immigration. What do you say to that?
I'm quite sure how the Cotswolds came into it specifically. I'd like to make a point, and this whole discussion we've been having here on immigration has gone the way of most of the public discourse on immigration in newspapers, on TV, everything you hear, lots of the debates I go to and attend. It's completely confusing the overall issue of immigration with our membership of the European Union. Our membership of the European Union gives citizens of other EU countries rights to come and work in the UK. And in my view, that's a benefit to the economy. In terms of people, the people in Calais, in the jungle, are not European citizens. They're citizens of countries from outside the EU. That problem would exist whether we were in the EU or not. It won't be solved by us leaving. In fact, it could get worse. I don't know if it will. I don't want to speculate. All I want to know is I'm being told it's going to get better, and I see no evidence of that at all. I think that we have a lot of remedies in our own hands, and our own government is culpable. When it comes to resources into our border force, for example, they're being decreased on a regular basis. I'm worried about illegal immigration. We have a lot of illegal immigrants in the UK. By definition, they're not EU citizens because their entry is not illegal. So what are we doing about that? None of this will change if we leave the EU. These issues will still remain, and I regret the tone which descends into a sort of xenophobia about anyone who's foreign. I just don't feel like that. I just don't live in a world where I'm suspicious of all foreigners. I don't live in a world where I say, I've got what I've got and I'm keeping it. That doesn't mean I disagree with David Davis. His description of what he expects an immigrant to do is absolutely spot on with mine. We don't disagree on that at all. Yes, learn English, embrace our culture, but it's got nothing to do with whether or not we're in the European Union.
I just answered the question.
Okay, our report is very low, and we're getting the right people in.
But you see, you made this assumption. Somebody asked a question about migration, I've answered it. Somebody asked a question about costs, I've answered it. I would tell you straight, the most important issue for me is sovereignty. That's what this is all about. And you know who's running the country at the moment. You know it's David Cameron. You know it's a Conservative government. You may or may not like that, but you know exactly who they are and you can get rid of them. Oh, but there's hardly anyone in this room who knows which political party, let's leave it aside, perhaps Julie Girling, I hope she does, which political party is running the European Parliament at the moment. I bet nobody here could actually name more than one or two European commissioners. And it's the commissioners that are making the laws. 50%, according to the House of Commons Library, of our laws are coming out of the European Union. So say the House of Commons Library. And yet nobody knows who these people are. That's the most important issue for me, that we were told we were going into a trading arrangement, at least that's what we were told up until now. Now all of a sudden everyone says, no, you should have known all along, it's all about European state. And it is set up in such a fashion that it is these civil servants, the commissioners, that make the laws that affect our lives, not the democratically elected members of the European Parliament. So lacking in powers are they, that they themselves, the MEPs, decided that they would vote to stop this annual, this sort of monthly charabanc where they all head off at enormous expense down to Strasbourg. They voted to stop that, but they weren't allowed to because they don't have the power to even decide where they're going to hold their parliaments. That's the major issue here. Who runs this country? Who makes our laws? Can we get rid of them or can't we? We can't get rid of those people. It is not democratic, and that's why we should vote me.
Jim Girling, you're an MEP, you sit in these parliaments. Are these mystical, faceless people making our laws?
Well, that was a kind of rather uninformed parody of what happens. What happens is, I'm elected by you. Well, maybe you didn't vote for me, but maybe you didn't vote in the European election, but you had the opportunity. The European Parliament is directly elected by the citizens of Europe. And after the Lisbon Treaty, we had full participation in European lawmaking. There wasn't a gunboat when our governments signed up to things like the Lisbon Treaty. There were not tanks on the lawn. These things were not rested. This sovereignty issue was not rested by acts of war. The governments, which David is so proud to tell you can get rid of, they signed those treaties. They signed those treaties on your behalf. We are where we are on that. It is not true that the Commission is made up of faceless bureaucrats who nobody elected. The members of the Commission, the commissioners, are appointed by the democratically elected governments of the 28 member states. Yes, I agree. One step away from direct election. I say to you, House of Lords. You know, there are all kinds of comparisons across the world. The US executive is made up of the president, who's directly elected, who appoints a cabinet. Not one of those people is elected. And it works for them. I don't think it's a great example of democracy, but many people do. It works for them. So the idea that the only form of democracy is a directly elected person, it comes in very different packages. So the Commission has got a democratic mandate. Many of the commissioners are ex-prime ministers, ex-foreign ministers of European countries. They're not nobodies, they're not nothings, they're people with lots of experience, and they use that experience to the benefit of Europe. Now, the Parliament that I sit in, 751 members of Parliament, not that many more than we've got in Westminster, but we managed to keep those costs down and be the Parliament for the whole of Europe. David made the point about not being able to decide whether or not we go to Strasbourg, and that's true. And the reason for that is because our member state governments signed a treaty that says that we will move times a year. Yes, we're not allowed because the sovereign governments that are in the council will not change that rule. Now that's fine with me. I'm happy not to go to Strasbourg, don't want to go. And I'm sure that we can come to some agreement at some point. But it's actually a minor issue. To say that I am not democratically elected and not responsible to you is entirely untrue. And we really have to kill this myth. It's an untruth that's being peddled. It's making you all believe, and I can see many of you really believe it, that MEPs are totally worthless. I spend 70 hours a week as an MEP. I work directly on legislation. I can bore you to death with the amount of amendments I put. I'm one of the highest amending members. And by the way, unlike Westminster, any amendment I put has to be voted. I have that right.
Okay.
The Speaker can't tell me no.
Let's not bore the audience to death. William, has David Cameron got greater influence over the EU than the commissioners?
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. But I must get back to this thing about sovereignty. When you're there, you just realise how much sovereignty or ability to run ourselves we've actually given up. Now, I'll give you one lightning example of this. There are in this country 4 mobile phone networks, which I'm not going to read out. One of them, E, was going to be absorbed. So the number of networks would have gone down from 4 to 3. Now, the UK regulator thought, and I don't know whether that's right or not, that this would be uncompetitive and not in the interests of the British consumer. But the decision is not made by the UK regulator. It's made by the EU Commissioner in charge of competition. Now, as it happens, and you've probably read in the papers, the EU Commissioner did agree with the UK regulator. But the fact of the matter is that even deciding about what mobile phone networks we have, or how many we have, that's not decided by us, because we've given that right away. Now, I don't know if anybody's got any appetite to hear anything about steel. Maybe David will be the only person who will. But as you know, that China is dumping steel on the European markets, which has terrible consequences for steel producers. Not just in the UK, but all over. I've been constantly lobbied by the European steel makers. Now, the United States immediately put 300% anti-dumping tariffs on steel imports from China. Now, we, on the other hand, the chap with the shaving picture of the industry, was I never remember his name. Sajid. I'm so sorry, I don't mean to insult him, I really don't. Sajid thought that we should do the same, but the British Trade Minister does not have the power to do that. The only person who has the power is the EU Commissioner. Now, I actually wrote to the EU Commissioner about 6 months ago requesting that this happen, if I can just put my minor plug in for myself, but that's not the point at all. Now, what the EU Commissioner did, the EU Commissioner took 5 months versus for the United States 2 months to put on a tariff of 40% versus the US's 300%. So the fact of the matter is, it is sovereignty. We don't have, not only is the question is that we don't democratically have the ability to rule ourselves, it's also that decisions, which are very, very important for this country, very, very important for people working, even for something like mobile phones, they aren't made by us, they're made by EU commissioners and not necessarily in the UK's national interest. That's the point.
I actually was under the impression that those who wanted to leave the European Union were intending to have good relations with China and develop trade contact.
Now, you were talking about George Osborne there.
So to proceed to hammer them with a tariff as punishment for their steel and then expect to negotiate some sort of agreement with them just doesn't make sense. Because, of course, what we have to do is make sure that we think holistically about trade and making it possible, for instance, for China to invest in Britain and Britain to sell products to China. But let's talk about sovereignty. We are here talking about a referendum which will be taking place on the 23rd of June. If we decide to vote to leave, that's what we will do. So I put it to you that if we can have a referendum to leave something which has apparently grabbed all our sovereignty, how is it that we can actually leave? And the answer is because we still are a sovereign country able to make our own decisions. What we have decided to do, usually with the European Union, is agree terms which are beneficial to us, working with our partners and sharing sovereignty where appropriate. So let's have a reality check on exactly how far we go with that and what areas we operate in. David suggested that we actually have 50% of our laws made in the European Parliament. Well, that made me worry, because I go to the House of Commons week after week. I think we've had about 600 divisions since the general election. We have passed legislation forcing councils to do one thing and another. We're about to change the rules of our schools. We're about to introduce new curriculum. We're about to have new arrangements for testing and so forth. If people stop passing out the tests before the children have actually taken them. And that's just education. We are in charge. We make decisions. We pass legislation. The Queen's speech has 21 bills in it, and some of them are really quite far-reaching, despite what the papers said. For instance, we're going to be changing our relationship with funny enough, the Court of Human Rights. That's our decision. That's what we can do. And that is a demonstration of the sovereignty that we have. And for those of you to think that we've lost our sovereignty, first of all, we're quite capable of leaving the European Union if that's what we decide. That's proof of sovereignty. Secondly, there are loads and loads of things that we do in the House of Commons which are all about sovereignty. So, the question, I suppose, is really this. Who's in charge when we deal with the European Union? We've heard that the Commission make all the decisions. No, they don't. The decisions are actually made by the Council of Ministers, where the Prime Minister represents Britain when it's a big issue, or the Secretary of State for Business and so on would represent if we're talking about those sort of issues. And he or she always comes back having made a decision. My argument is that we don't necessarily know how they arrived at that decision. I'd like to see more transparency. But that decision is made with the involvement and cooperation of British ministers. It is not a job of the Commission to make all of those forms of decisions. And I think we've really got to be clear about that, because that brings me on to the next most important point. Britain's at its best when we are actually forthright, positive and determined to make reforms. I've got one more point to make, and it's this. When we decided we wanted a single market, that's what we came up with. And we did it because we were determined as a powerful nation within the European Union to bring about that single market. Margaret Thatcher saw the need for it. She drove it through. Lord Cofield, as a trade minister, commissioner, helped her do it. And we have built on that ever since. So that's an example of where Britain can not just get involved, it can actually make changes, and those changes are through exercising our sovereignty through the European Union.
Okay. Let's move on. We've got another question from Peter Bowman.
Mr. Cameron reassures us that the UK will prosper in a reformed EU. What I wonder is, do the panellists know what these reforms may be, and when can we expect them to be enacted?
All right, well, let's start at the heart of this. Let's go to the European Parliament, William.
Well, Mr. Cameron, the Prime Minister, who's head of government, who as head of government I have great respect for, at the maximum moment of leverage, at the maximum moment of influence, when there's a referendum, which maybe he's going to win, maybe he's going to lose, he goes onto the European Union and says, please renegotiate, please will you renegotiate our terms of membership. Now in practice, he asked for very little and he came out with less. He didn't even get what he asked for in fiddling around with slightly more defined benefits, which didn't really amount to very much. He didn't even get that. And this is at the absolute maximum moment of leverage. So the fact of the matter is, you hear all this jargon phrase, a reformed European Union. We want to be a member of a reformed European Union. Let's be absolutely clear. A reformed European Union wasn't on offer. It isn't on offer now, and it's never going to happen. What is going to happen is more and more and more EU integration. The Eurozone countries are going to get closer and closer and closer together. And the gentleman there, one of the reasons for the massive level of unemployment in southern Europe is because of the Eurozone. The Greek and Italian economies simply cannot function in the same monetary zone as Germany. It just doesn't work. And the only people who are going to bail them out are going to be the Germans, and the price which they're going to exact is more and more EU integration. So I must also make the point, this is in 4 words, the fact of the matter is, when considering how to vote in this referendum, the fact of the matter is the status quo is not on offer. It's going to be more and more and more expensive, and more or less of actually what people want.
Julie Goning?
Sorry, the question was what's going to be reformed about Europe. Well, it comes down to a couple of things. The first is greater competitiveness. That's what the Prime Minister's reform agenda is all about. It's about making Europe more competitive. It's a more competitive marketplace for us, which means that we will thrive within that. That will involve a completion of the single market in services, because it was mentioned earlier that that's not complete. and I agree with that. That needs to be completed double quick time. What I would like to see is the UK as the leading economy in the non-Eurozone. And it's very important that we see this as a Eurozone and non-Eurozone issue, as the leading economy in the non-Eurozone, pushing the economic vitality of the non-Eurozone countries forward. That's where our future in Europe lies. We're not joining the Euro. We have protection against Eurozone countries caucusing against us. That was part of his reform agenda, and he got it. And we need to go forward to make sure that we thrive leading that. I see a reformed Europe being much more around the way in which the British economy works. It is that job is not complete. And I don't think that we should move away from that. I think we should stay, we should complete it, and then Europe as a whole will thrive in the future.
David Davis, it's all here. David Cameron did a good job, didn't he?
Yes, I mean, he perhaps did a good job of spending £9 million on this document, which I don't think many people read. More in Wales, where it's bilingual. But isn't it interesting that the debate tonight, the debate we see on the television, is all about, is it going to cause World War III, a collapse in the economy, or a plague of frogs, or whatever it is that the Remainers want to come out with this week? David Cameron called this referendum. He must have known when he called it that there was a chance that people are going to vote to come out. The polls seem to show that it's very close. So he must have, he took that decision, knowing perfectly well that the vote could go in either direction. And as a responsible Prime Minister, which I'm sure he is, he wouldn't have done that if he thought that either of those results was going to be a big disaster. The one thing, though, that's interesting that nobody on the Remain side wants to debate is David Cameron's reforms, his negotiations with the EU, and yet that is the thing that we should be discussing. We should be talking about whether he got a good deal or not. But it's the one thing they don't want to discuss, because as William's already said, he went out there asking for very, very little and got even less. And when it comes down to a situation where people can come into this country from much poorer countries with a much cheaper standard of living, without their children, and still continue to claim child benefit for children who don't even live in this country, and we can't even do anything about that. It shows how much of a loss of sovereignty there's been, and how little reform there is in the European Union. There is no chance of reforming it, because they don't want reform. They're unreformable. They deliberately devised a system where commissioners can make the laws, people like Julie can add amendments to them, which may or may not be taken. But ultimately, that's the way it was drawn up, because that's what they wanted. And I'm afraid the whole system is irreformable. And we need to think now about what it's going to look like in 20 years' time, because if we vote to stay in, we're going to end up there for a very long time, and we'll have very little control over what it looks like in decades from now.
James Greenwood, is the system broken? Can it be fixed?
Well, if we leave, then we're going to have absolutely no opportunity to do anything about it whatsoever. And that's why we need to be, and I could not agree more that it needs reform. The Green Party, surprisingly, have a sort of similar position to a sort of rational and moderate Tory on membership of the EU, which is that we should stay in. But we do need some serious reform. It's been mentioned already that other countries are finding their people saying, you know what, I'm not sure this is exactly working for us. But these things take time. You know, these things take a long time, and I know that's frustrating. And I know that people want change immediately, but when you're trying to work with 500 million people, it takes time. But I just think it is so worth it. I mean, there's a list of reforms that we would like to see, which I won't bore you with. But I'd like to say one thing about sovereignty, and that is that the members of the panel and the EU itself, actually, I think is deluding themselves when it comes to TTIP, because this treaty with America is going to basically allow American corporations to sue us for decisions that we have taken. It's fair enough. I'll move away. Let's take reform. We need reform, and to get reform, we need to be in it.
Let's take 3 lines from Neil Carmichael.
First of all, the reforms, I'm quite happy to talk about them because they're very important ones. The first thing we did was we made sure that if the Eurozone does anything which might affect our interests in financial services, we'll have an ability to stop that from happening. And I think that's a really important point, and it's enshrined in the agreement. anyone thinks about the scale and scope of our financial services sector, they should be pleased that is there. The second thing that we've done, just to embellish Julie's point, is that the single market will not just include more services, but crucially the digital economy, which is for us a really important piece of information, because we are leaders in digital economy. You may not think so in certain parts of Gloucestershire, given the broadband connections, but we actually are really good at the digital economy, and which will give us a huge boost. The third thing that has happened is that we've basically got a kind of a blocking system with parliaments, so that if parliaments get together and don't want to stop something which has been decided already in the European Council, we can. So we've got that veto system. And the fourth thing that we've got is an exemption forever from what they call ever closer union. And I think that's a really important point. And if anyone has any doubts about the longevity of that exemption, just ask the Danish Prime Minister, who's got a similar agreement, and it's 22 years old and going strong. So those are the reforms, and they are really useful reforms, and they demonstrate that the European Union has been reformed and should be reformed, and there's more reforms coming if we stay in, because that's where we will be able to deal with that. Do you want to pick up a point David said about social security?
Let's not do that. Let's not do that. Well, let's move on. This time is cracking on.
Okay, fair enough.
We're going to go to the final question, and I'm going to ask you this because it's something that's close to my heart. We enjoy free and easy travel across Europe at the moment, and the budget airlines are getting cheaper and cheaper. What will happen to the cost of European flights and holidays if we leave the EU? And bearing in mind, Michael O'Leary from Ryanair says, well, clearly staying in the single market is better for his profits. That's really good of him. And cheaper airfares come from Britain's membership of the single market. Now, I looked on David Davis's website today, and he's checked Ryanair, and he says that the flights to Norway are no more expensive.
£12.99 this morning.
Yeah. So we're going to do a rapid fire answer there. Now, starting with James, what's going to happen to our flights, holidays, and everything else if we leave the EU?
Well, we're not, to be frank, in favour of cheap flights. We think...
I didn't say that.
We weren't going to talk about the environment, so we're going to get a chance for that.
No,
we're not in favour of cheap flights. I think that people should try and manage their consumption. Many business people here, that meeting in Milan, can you not do it by Skype? I'm afraid we think that they are artificially low, and I think that the European as a whole should be able to better manage the way in which we consume aviation fuel.
Julie, go ahead.
What will happen? The honest answer is I don't know. It's not the biggest issue for me in terms of our membership of the European Union or not. It's a bit of a sideshow. I think I'm not one who says that we're all going to have to pay 10 times as much for holidays. That would just be pointless scaremongering. Actually, I don't know. I don't think anybody else does.
Okay, Neil Carmichael.
Well, basically, it's a fluidity of movement that really matters here. The EasyJet success and Ryanair, to some extent, has all been created by the fact that we've got free movement, and it is free movement that drives that kind of prosperity and that kind of flexibility and option. So if we want to keep that, it's best to stay in the European Union. I'm not saying that the aeroplanes will suddenly stop flying, but the real question is do we want our young people, our businesses to thrive and to flourish? And I think the answer is yes. That's why our young people are so determined to remain in the European Union, because they understand that flexibility and the opportunities that come from it. And to stop them doing that, or at least restrict them, I think would be a very, very unfortunate thing.
David Davis?
Well, you can fly, as I said earlier on, you can fly to Norway, which is not in the European Union, for £12.99 today with Ryanair. It's absolutely ludicrous to suggest that coming out of the EU is going to have any impact whatsoever. You can also fly with EasyJet to Jordan and to Israel, and they're not in the EU yet, and I don't think even the EU want them in just at the moment, although who knows the way things are going around here. So what I want, and I love cheap flights, by the way, I love being able to fly cheaply. It's great that we can do that, and I love the idea of being able to fly over a wonderful collection of countries that are all trading freely with each other, but are not run by an unaccountable, unelected elite of
Yeah, first of all, cheaper air travel was driven by the Open Skies Agreement, of which the United States was the instigator. It didn't have anything to do with the European Union. Ryanair had this great thing of flying to lesser airports like Charleroi in Belgium and like Verona. All these places which pretend to be near places actually quite a long way away. They got subsidies from the councils, from the municipalities who control these airports. The European Union's immediate reaction was to stop them doing that under state aid rules. Now, by the way, here in the southwest, as Julie Gurley will know much better than me, I have no doubt, we have Newquay Airport and the Scilly Isles Airport have been given a derogation from the European Union state aid rules. However, that does run out. So there's a long-term threat to those two airports, which would not be a good thing. And then finally, Mr. Neil Carmichael's great land of opportunity, 60% youth unemployment in Greece, 50% youth unemployment in Spain, 40% youth unemployment in Italy. Frankly, tell that to those people there. Tell that to those people there.
Let's move on. I really want to get one final question. Is Nigel Evers here, please? Is he here? Otherwise I'll read his question out. He's not here. The question is, how will leaving the EU impact on environmental legislation in the UK? Something close to my heart, because David is saying that it will carry on. Will it carry on? Are we doing better things with Europe?
I'd like to start by answering a question about red tape, which was asked before and wasn't answered. I'm not only a part-time politician, but I'm also an estate agent, so that probably makes me the least popular in the room by quite a long way. When EPCs, which you mentioned, were brought in to this country, this is a test of how environmentally friendly your house is. They were basically, I think the words used were foisted on us. The government said, we can't do anything about it, you've got to have these measures of your house. And the industry kicked up the most terrible fuss about it, so we don't have anything to do with this. But they came in, and it's taken a decade. But a decade down the line, people are now starting to realise that actually this is important. This is a measure of the house that you're looking to buy. This is important in terms of how much it's going to cost and how much it's going to maintain. And it is important in terms of the environment. And I'm afraid that I don't trust the government when it comes to the environment. As Paul said, back in the 70s, we were the sick man of Europe. That wasn't just economically, but we had some terrible issues. And I think the first duty of government is the defence of its people. And personally, I think that we are entering a new, really exciting phase in terms of defence. We're in a global world where I can get onto my phone and I can speak to somebody on a street in China. We have incredible access to each other. And we're able to start to face up to some of the problems that we face as a whole. And that main problem is us fouling our own nest. And the defence of a government for its people has to be concerned with climate change. One of the reasons why the Syrian conflict came into being was because of 5 years of unprecedented drought. That's one of the reasons why one of the reasons why the I'm sorry, I was murmuring at the end.
It's just the most ludicrous statement I've ever heard. And I've been
well, that is one of the reasons. That is one of the reasons why the Syrian conflict started. So climate change is an issue, as are sustainable food supplies, as is clean air and clean water. These are absolutely elementary and essential things to all of us. And 80% of our environmental legislation has been enforced, foisted, are the words that are often used, on us by the European Union. But I think it has been of immense value and immense benefit to us. And I am frightened that if we leave the EU there will be a race to the bottom by government. Electoral cycles do not naturally fit in with environmental cycles. It takes a lot longer than 5 years to grow a tree. And I think we've already seen the assault on renewables by the government at this time. But my last point is that I think if we leave the EU, we're going to miss an incredible opportunity. And, you know, this is the Chamber of Commerce here. There's a report that came out recently showing how the Southwest could be entirely fueled by renewables. I think if we left the EU, we would leave that promising that we have to many countries which are a lot further ahead and a lot further down the line than us. And we would be left adrift, dependent on imported gas and nuclear fuel. The thing about the renewable energy industry and this report, and what they said was this: if we did go down this line, it's an aspirational. I come from an aspirational party. We're trying to vision and look forward to where we can be. It would produce, if this is the Southwest alone, 122,000 jobs and an extra £6 billion per annum into the economy.
Okay. Julie Girling, let's have your last word on this. You're in the European Parliament. If we left, are we going to be subject to repealing these environmental laws?
Yes, not only in the European Parliament, but the European Conservative spokesman and lead member on environment issues, so it's something I'm very, very close to. And I'll give you a small example of where we are. I totally agree with David. We're not going to repeal every piece of environmental legislation, of course not. Nobody's suggesting it. Although I would say that many people, when they talk about red tape, a lot of that red tape and all those regulations are environmental. So when they say that they're going to throw them out, beware. But I work on the legislative process, and I am then Parliament's lead member for the whole Parliament on air quality, which does not respect national borders. 50% of what you're breathing in here comes from outside the UK. France, Netherlands, Spain, depending on which way the wind's blowing, and we export our air to them. It's a good single market in air quality. So, what am I involved in at the moment? I'm involved in this legislative process that apparently MEPs aren't, where we're at the final point on air quality legislation between the Council of Ministers, that's governments, and the Parliament. And I lead the formal negotiations for the Parliament. We are at the point where we cannot reach agreement. We cannot reach agreement because the member states, particularly our own government, and it's my government, I'm a Conservative, I don't like to have to say this, particularly our own government, will not commit to the levels of reduction in pollution that we require. We're not asking for the world, we're asking for a 50% increase in health improvements, which equates to 200,000 people dying by 2030. And our government is saying no. So, I leave that with you to decide whether the EU is a force for good in terms of environmental, or whether you would be better off leaving it to the British government.
Right. That is our last question, and that is our last reply.